Hey, what's up? Welcome to the big blue month of September. I am so glad we are finally in the Burr months, but unfortunately, September is still technically and astrologically summer for over 3 weeks, basically about 22 or 23 days. So, now that hurricane made landfall, it's a good thing it didn't hit Texas. But unfortunately, we are not out of the woods yet. So anyway, I just really want to stop thinking about that. And that's one of the many things I hate, as I've talked about before, about hurricanes and all that. It's not just what they can do, but the fact that they take away my ability to really think about other things that I'd rather think about. And they can easily become an obsession if there's one that's supposed to make landfall here, whether or not it does. Sort of like the year of Hurricane Rita in 2005, and then 3 years later we got a direct hit from Hurricane Ike. And during both years I became very obsessed with hurricanes in general. So enough about the hurricanes. One thing I would like to talk about, I want to make a video that I've been intending to make somehow, but just never really got around to doing it because it could get very offensive. And the title, I want it to be Part-Time Moms. Okay, the reason I'm thinking about this is because every time there's a hurricane in the Gulf, they're very likely to make landfall in an area that I used to live in for my first 6 years of life. And I lived in that area, and it's a good thing. I like the fact that I lived in this one house for exactly my first 6 years of life. Like, I celebrated my 6th birthday in '89, and that summer, within a few months, we moved to Texas because of my dad's job. Okay? So, because of that, it is very easy to remember whether I was 5 or 6 when something happened. As I've stated before, my memory doesn't really begin until like at least 2.5 to 3, which is why Angelica is the only Rugrat that I can really relate to as a character. I don't really have a memory of being the age of the younger characters. And, since they don't talk to adults, although I did at that age, it's like I really can't relate to them at all. So, my earliest childhood memories are from, let's just say, about 3 years old. Probably closer to 4, for the most part, because there aren't many things I remember about being 3. So, the things I do remember of my first 6 years of life were pretty much ages 4 and 5, and maybe a little bit from when I was 3. And, like I've stated, it is a good thing that at the age of 6 was a turning point in my life wherein I started losing baby teeth. I went to kindergarten a year late because my mom didn't want me to go to school at age 5. She also didn't like the elementary school where we used to live. Because it was all-day kindergarten, whereas they had half-day kindergarten in Texas. And so 1989 was a turning point. We moved to Texas, I lost my first baby tooth, and I entered kindergarten. So it is very easy for me to remember whether I was 5 or 6 when something happened. Okay? The only way I could have possibly been 6 is if it was maybe the first month of my 7th year of life, where we spent that last month at our old house preparing to move to Texas. So basically, it really just kind of marked off, my first half dozen years of childhood. And of course, from that point on, I remember things very vividly. As I got into school, and it's like, how could I forget, whether something happened in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and so on, because, you know, I had certain teachers and certain classmates and whatnot when certain things happened. And so I'm also pretty good with dates. But what I want to talk about, you know, is how from very early on, you know, I got a very bad impression of working moms. And I know that's considered normal these days. You know, probably more working moms than stay-at-home moms. But one of the many reasons why I would never want to have kids is because, you know, to have even a 1% chance that I would have to be a working mom, you know, and put my kids in a don't care is just unbearable. You know, it's just one of the many things that would be unbearable about having kids, would be to have to go to work and put my kids in a daycare. And when I look back on my first, you know, half dozen years of life, my first 6 years, one of the things I remember was, you know, that there were kids in my neighborhood, and by the way, they were almost all boys. You know, I was like the only little girl in the neighborhood. There might have been one older girl that occasionally stayed with her grandma. But in my neighborhood, all the younger kids in my age group were little boys. And I often wonder if that's why I feel like I'm in the wrong body and I hate being female. But I remember these kids that used to be our next door neighbors, 2 boys on one side and 2 boys on the other, and then a little boy across the street. And so they were all around my age, you know, born in the 80s, maybe a little younger for the most part. Only one boy was older. And so they would go to daycare and other things like it, you know, a church nursery in one case, and, you know, just various things. You know, the older boy was, of course, in school, you know, by the time I left. And some of them actually moved before we did to other places because it was really a small community and not a lot of stuff going on there, you know, not a lot of job opportunities. And of course my dad lost his job, and it is very prone to hurricanes. The only good thing is that it doesn't quite have the population of a bigger city, so when they have a hurricane, it doesn't have a high death toll because it is a somewhat rural area. And I often wonder, you know, how my life would have been if I'd have just spent, you know, the rest of my childhood there and gone to school there. But then I'm also glad I moved to Texas because, like I've stated before, there's just no place like Texas. But I just had a very negative view on working moms because the moms who worked, you know, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And the ones who worked, you know, would send their kids to daycare, little bitty kids. And these 2 boys in particular, who are adults now, you know, that have wives or girlfriends and whatnot, they would get sick all the time. And they actually went into pneumonia and were hospitalized. And that's pretty much all I remember about them. So basically, you know, the few colds that I got during my first 6 years of life, because as I've stated before, kindergarten was my absolute worst year for colds. Like, I had never had a year that bad in my entire life, well, which was only 6 years. But I think my first year of life, I didn't get a cold until I was 5.5 months old or something like that. So basically, my mom tried to protect me as much as she could from getting sick when I was a baby and a young child. And one of the things she did was stay home. She was a stay-at-home mom. And I'm just ever so thankful for that. And so, you know, like I said, the few times I was ever sick as a child under age 6 was a lot of times when these neighborhood kids, you know, I'd go play with them or you know, my mom would bring me over so that she could exchange Christmas presents. And some of the few colds that I remember, and you know, much to my mom's dismay, happened when I would come in contact with other kids whose moms worked and put them in daycare, or who were older than me and went to school, you know, like some of my cousins. And, you know, it just really makes me appreciate, you know, how important it is to stay home if you're going to have kids. And some of the worst teachers I ever had, you know, the best teachers I ever had were women without kids. Okay, you just can't beat that. A woman without kids makes an excellent teacher. Okay, but then the worst teachers I had were the ones with little bitty kids, you know, multiple little kids in daycare. Or, you know, the ones that got pregnant during the school year. And somewhere in between would be the teachers who had kids that would go to school anyway. You know, older kids, adult kids, you know, what have you. They were somewhere in between. But what I'm trying to say is that the job suffers for the kids as the kids suffer for the job. Okay? They can never be quite as good of a mom, you know, as if they stayed home, but then they were never quite as good of a teacher as they would be if they didn't have kids. You know, they couldn't give their all to either one. So, you know, that just really makes me glad I don't have kids, you know, because I would just not want to be a part-time mom.